distinguished by multiple angled walls. The artillery at Fort Carillon weighed up to 6,000 pounds apiece. The artillery's elevation could be adjusted for greater accuracy and distance, but it was very difficult to move a 6,000-pound cannon from side to side. The angled walls of a Vauban-style fort were designed so that no matter where the enemy was located, at least several artillery pieces would be aimed in their direction. The fort was designed to house about 400 men, but during the summer months of 1756 to 1759, 4,000 to 5,000 French troops were stationed on the Ticonderoga Peninsula. They used the fort to launch an attack on Fort William Henry in 1757. Louis-Joseph Marquis de Montcalm, the commander of French troops in North America, used Carillon as his launching point for the attack. The Marquis de Montcalm took artillery from Fort Carillon and floated it to the southern end of Lake George and Fort William Henry. In early August 1757, the French began their siege at Fort William Henry, and after several days forced the British to surrender. When the French captured Fort William Henry, they destroyed it and withdrew back to Fort Carillon. In 1758, after suffering one defeat after another, the British planned 3 major attacks to crush New France. An attack was planned for Fort Duquesne, located at what is now Pittsburgh, on the Ohio, Monongahela, and Allegheny rivers. Another attack was aimed at Louisburg on Cape Breton Island. Louisburg guarded access to the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the St. Lawrence River. The third attack, planned for Fort Carillon and Fort St. Frederick in the Champlain Valley, would make it possible for the British to push to Montreal and Quebec City, the heart of Canada. The attack at Ticonderoga was under the command of General James Abercrombie. He amassed an army of 17,000 men, 6,000 British regular troops, and 11,000 colonial provincial troops. In early July, Abercrombie, commander-in-chief of all British troops in North America in 1758, left the southern end of Lake George with a fleet of more than 1,000 boats to transport his 17,000 men the 32-mile length of Lake George. They landed at the northern end of the lake on July 6, 1758, about 4 miles away from Fort Carillon. As the British headed into the woods, they ran into a patrol of French troops who were trying to return to Fort Carillon. A skirmish erupted, and the second-in-command for the British, Brigadier General George Augustus Howe, was killed. Lord Howe was a regular British officer and a relative of King George II. Trained as a British officer, Lord Howe was a renowned military tactician who understood that fighting in the North American wilderness was completely different from fighting on the open battlefields of Europe. General Abercrombie was more interested in logistics. Abercrombie could move 17,000 troops to the northern end of Lake George, but the actual strategy and tactics of the battle were devised by Lord Howe. Howe's death created a serious military loss for Abercrombie. It also gave the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, more time. He knew from intelligence reports that he was about to face an army of more than 15,000 men. Montcalm had 4,000 to 4,500 men at Fort Carillon. Not knowing that Lord Howe had been killed, Montcalm expected an imminent attack. If Montcalm brought all his troops into the fort, he would abandon the heights of Carillon to the northwest. The British could then move on to the heights, put artillery in place, and lay siege to the fort, eventually forcing the French garrison to either try to fight its way out, abandon the fort, or surrender. Montcalm took a serious risk when he decided to take most of his troops up to the heights. Within 48 hours, they constructed a long wall, 8 feet tall and about a half-mile long, that zigzagged across the peninsula. It became known as the French Lines on the heights of Carillon, and served as a good defensive earthwork and logwork fortification when the British launched their attack on July 8, 1758. The British plan fell apart the minute the first shot was fired. Abercrombie's plan was to deploy his men out of range along the entire line and send artillery barges down the Lachute River to land on the south side of the river, facing into the left flank of the French lines. But the Lachute River, particularly in the summer, is choked with high reeds. British troops rowing the barges down the river were unfamiliar with the territory. The British missed their landing site and came into range of the fort's artillery, following the river and forced to withdraw. When the French artillery opened fire, some of the British amassed believed that that was the signal to start the attack. However, other British troops ignored the signal. The British plan was to attack the entire line and overwhelm the French. But when the British failed to attack as a whole unit, it gave the French a distinct advantage. The British had to move out of range if they wanted to move along the line. This put the British on the outside of a U-shaped battle line, while the French were deployed on the inside of the U-shape, where it was much easier to move troops to wherever the fighting was the fiercest. Early in the day, before the battle was launched, Abercrombie sent out scouts to check the French line. The scouts reported that the French line wasn't strong, that it was merely an abattis, a group of branches pulled together and sharpened, a kind of 18th century barbed wire. However, the abattis masked the log wall behind it. The abattis' branches and sharp points snagged clothes and entangled the British, and the zigzag wall meant they were being shot at from different directions. Meanwhile, the French were protected by the log wall, shooting over it at the British troops, who were proving to be easy targets. Near the end of the day, one of the biggest attacks against the French lines was led by the 42nd Highland Regiment. Of 1,000 men in that regiment, fewer than 500 left the field at the end of the day. July 8, 1758, would be the single bloodiest day in American history until the second year of the Civil War and the Battle of Antietam. The next year, Abercrombie's replacement, Sir Geoffrey Amherst, who had successfully captured Louisburg the year before, was made British Commander-in-Chief and launched another attack at Fort Carillon in July of 1759. Amherst's army of 10,000 approached Carillon by way of Lake George again, landing in late July. Astonished that the French weren't holding their lines, Amherst did exactly what Montcalm was afraid of the year before. He used the heights to launch a siege campaign against Fort Carillon. On the evening of July 26, 1759, Amherst prepared to open fire with his siege artillery the next morning. Somehow the French figured out Amherst's plan, and after dark on July 26th, they abandoned the fort. But before they left, they ignited the fort's powder magazine, destroying much of the eastern side of the fort and setting the rest on fire. General Amherst changed the name of Fort Carillon to Fort Ticonderoga. Ticonderoga came from a Mohawk name meaning place between the waters, Lake Champlain and Lake George. In September 1759, Quebec City fell to General James Wolfe and the British. The only part of French Canada still in French hands by the end of 1759 was Montreal. It fell in September 1760. It marked the end of the French and Indian War in North America. Life at Fort Ticonderoga remained calm until the outbreak of the American Revolution. Once again, Fort Ticonderoga's strategic location made it a key target. In May of 1775, the American army outside Boston desperately needed artillery. Both Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold formed plans to capture Fort Ticonderoga. Fort Ticonderoga was known to have more than 100 pieces of artillery, with only about 40 British soldiers and 25 women and children posted there. It seemed an easy target. Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold agreed to jointly attack the fort. Before dawn on May 10, 1775, Fort Ticonderoga was captured by the Americans, who held the fort for the next 2 years. Ticonderoga was used as a launching point for an American invasion on Canada in the fall of 1775, led by General Richard Montgomery. Montgomery's attack on Quebec City in a blizzard on New Year's Eve, 1775, proved to be a disaster. Montgomery was killed and his second-in-command, General Benedict Arnold, severely wounded. The American army spent the remainder of the winter laying siege to Quebec, but was not strong enough to attack. When the ice in the St. Lawrence River melted in the spring of 1776, British Royal Navy reinforcements arrived at Quebec City, and the American army began a long retreat that ended at Ticonderoga in early July of 1776. The Americans who made it to Ticonderoga expected the British to recapture the fort. This time the attack would come from the north, so the American troops built a second fortification across the lake on Mount Independence. Together, Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Independence became a strong defensive choke point on Lake Champlain. In 1776, Benedict Arnold returned to Lake Champlain to build a fleet on the southern end of the lake, while the British were doing the same thing at the northern end. The two fleets met in the Battle of Valcour Island in October of 1776. Arnold's fleet was outnumbered and practically wiped out. In battles on October 11th and October 13th, Arnold lost 11 of his 15 vessels. Only 4 returned to Ticonderoga safely. In 1776, with more than 15,000 troops defending Ticonderoga, the British withdrew to Canada, postponing an attack until the next spring. The attack in the spring of 1777 was led by General John Burgoyne and his army of about 10,000 men, half British troops, and the rest from Germany. By June 1777, Fort Ticonderoga had a force of just 2,500 under the command of General Arthur St. Clair. Burgoyne cut access to Lake George, the fort's supply line and major escape route. Meanwhile, the German troops were on the Vermont shore, working their way to Mount Independence. If the British captured Mount Independence, the Americans would be surrounded. So, on the evening of July 5th, 1777, the Americans abandoned Fort Ticonderoga. Without a shot being fired, the fort was once again in British hands. By November of 1777, Fort Ticonderoga's military history ended when the British abandoned it and retreated to Canada. After the Revolutionary War, more and more settlers moved into the region and helped themselves to the deserted fort's stones to build fireplaces, foundations, and entire homes. In 1820, a New York businessman named William Ferris Pell bought the fort. He built a summer hotel near the ruins because the site was already attracting tourists and sightseers. Pell put an end to the pilfering of the stone and preserved what was left of Fort Ticonderoga. His great-grandson, Stephen Pell, with the help of an English architect named Alfred Bosson, and most importantly, Stephen Pell's wife's wealth, began rebuilding Fort Ticonderoga in 1908. He had opened to the public in July 1909, and Fort Ticonderoga has been open as a museum every season since 1909.